Hello, my name is Matthew Flegal, and I am a senior manager of the In Vivo Sciences group at Charles River Laboratories in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. And today, as the title indicates, I'm going to be discussing not just how we developed a ICV model for rodent injections, but more importantly, what were the challenges, what were the struggles, and how did we overcome them in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic that we are currently all dealing with. As just a brief biography, I've been in the lab animal research and surgical field since about 1993. I've had the luck and, frankly, the fun of working in a whole host of areas, be it cardiovascular, device implantation, central nervous system, pulmonary, device development, transplant, etc. And I've also had the good fortune to work with a wide variety of species, from mice to non-human primates to livestock. I've been a supervisor and a manager in these types of groups and departments since 2003. And what will factor in to what we're going to discuss for the next 25 minutes or so, I've also been the principal surgical instructor for several hundred surgeons and anesthetists for about the last quarter century. Along with that, I am an adjunct professor for the lab animal surgical classes at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I have the good fortune to manage a team of a little bit over 70 people right now in Shrewsbury, Mass. Technicians, surgeons, anesthetists, supervisors, data reviewers, team leaders, lab assistants, and what have you. As far as the procedure that we're going to talk about today, one of the things that made it doable is I've been doing these for a long time. I've done a lot of them. My logs aren't complete, but they reflect over 10,000 of these surgical cases, be they into the cerebroventricular area, hippocampal, device implantation, etc. I've also been able to do webinars for the Veterinary Bioscience Institute for this. And on this particular procedure, which really helped in what we're going to discuss, I've been able to train about 150 people in these particular procedures. And I put all that out there because one would have thought that what I was going to discuss was fairly straightforward. As you can imagine, it has been a little bit less than straightforward for the past 4 or 5 months. I'm also, just as an overview, the procedures that we're talking about, what we're doing is we're injecting into the CSF-filled chamber in the brain. There are 2 of them, 2 lateral ventricles, left and right, that go into a central canal. The reason that we're doing this work is many of the compounds that work on the central nervous system will not cross the blood-brain barrier. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing that, but understand it limits both the size and the type of materials that you can give as a dosage anywhere in the body. So for instance, the classic taking a pill or getting a shot, many of those compounds will not cross over into the brain, which is a problem with central nervous system compounds. For us, it can cost a tremendous amount of time, effort, and money in a pharmaceutical or a biotech company to engineer your molecule to cross the blood-brain barrier. And before you spend all of those resources, you'd probably like to know if it's actually going to work if it gets there. And that's why we have this particular model. What it allows the various companies to do is they can kill off a compound early in the development cycle because it's not going to do what they were hoping before they spend hundreds to thousands of hours, millions to tens of millions of dollars, months to years of time figuring out how to get this to get into the brain. In this case, we're injecting test articles such as small molecules, gene therapy vectors, ASOs, etc., directly into the cerebral spinal fluid in the brain. We use the lateral ventricles because they're the largest area. As you'll see in a little bit, that's all relative. The CSF then bathes the entire brain in the CSF which allows the compound to be distributed throughout the entire brain. What makes this rather uniquely difficult as a surgical procedure is you're effectively working blind. You're injecting into an area of the body that you can't see, or you certainly can't see it unless you're going to do a tremendous amount of operation and potentially causing tremendous amount of trauma. We can't see the area that we're going to be ultimately injecting in. So what we need to do is we use landmarks, in this case bregma, which is the intersection of two sutures on top of the skull, and then an atlas, which is designed to tell you in 3 dimensions, where do you go from that particular point to find the spot that you are trying to access. And as you can imagine, properly identifying bregma is incredibly important, especially when you're aiming for a target that is 1/10 of a millimeter or smaller. This is what it looks like in a live mouse. Plenty of undulations. It is not nearly as easy to discern where the intersection actually is as it appears in a nice line drawing. These are indications of where we are generally targeting. The black spaces on the right are those lateral ventricles, and you can see in a euthanized animal where we've done a dye injection on the upper left, you can see the dye in the lateral ventricles, and then the lighter shading in the picture below is the CSF area itself. And what makes this uniquely challenging is that we're targeting, if you were to pull a credit card or a debit card out of your wallet, we're aiming for a target that is approximately 1/2 to 1/3 the depth of your card. So turn it on end, look at it. We wish it were that large. So it's not necessarily the most technically challenging of procedures, but it is very, very precise. And then finally, to add a little bit of a challenge, different strains of animals have different head shapes. The atlases that we use are based off a relatively small number of animals in one very specific strain, also males, not females, and there are differences between the two. So there are a lot of things that we have to do to make sure that in that particular strain of that particular group at that particular age, that we're actually hitting what we want to hit. And I have other webinars out there on that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Because here's the point. We met with a client at the tail end of last year, a large pharmaceutical, and they wanted us to develop this resource in-house, running approximately 1 to 2 studies per week. And so we had an original plan, somewhat aggressive, but doable. We were going to obtain the equipment in January and February. In March, we were going to run a pilot study and start generating individual studies for our clients. By April and May, we would be bringing the apprentice surgeons so that we would have some depth to the capability. May, June, we would be validating them. And all of this until approximately February to March of this year seemed like a fairly straightforward thing. We've all in this industry done this multiple times. But of course, there was one minor unexpected challenge. And that forced a lot of changes to us. And what I'd like to spend the bulk of this time discussing is what are the things that came up? What were the things that we expected? And how were we able to overcome these challenges so that all of us, as this pandemic continues affecting us, how are we ready for the next unexpected obstacle, if you will? And the challenges were many. There were challenges to staffing, there were challenges to supply chains. This requires very specialized equipment with a handful of manufacturers. Most of them seem to be based in either New York State or California, which of course very aggressively closed down. We also run anywhere from dozens to over 100 studies concurrently within my group. And the exact same challenges were hitting every single study every single sponsor and client that we had were dealing with the same things as well. So there were ripple effects that affected us in here. Communication, face-to-face meetings went away. The ability to sit in a meeting room with the various stakeholders disappeared. And measuring success or failure, again, everything was distributed. It made many of our normal functions remarkably more difficult. We were successful, not to give you a spoiler. Here's why, and this is really important. You need a solid foundation that can roll with the various punches that you're going to have. I have a very motivated and capable technical staff. I have outstanding supervisors. I have a great management tree. Without that, none of this would have been successful because this was vastly harder for my technicians and supervisors than we would have expected. Knowing the procedure helped. And so the fact that I and a few others had a significant amount of experience really, really helped because we were able, because we understood the nuances and the depths of the procedure, we were able to problem solve in a way that had we been new to this, we probably would not have been able to. Again, I mentioned upper management. You need their support. I had it. If we hadn't, I would have a very, very different talk for you today. It would probably be mostly along the lines of what not to do during a pandemic. We needed resources beyond my group. We have an outstanding study director in Nick Jones. We have the people around us who were able to contribute scientific, necropsy, all kinds of affiliated groups that were also all dealing with the same things. And they had to be solid, and they had to be able to roll with these punches as well. We're going to talk a lot about relationships. Our vendors saved us. Had we not had vendors who were going to go above and beyond, we wear surgical masks. You all may recall that back in March and April, it was remarkably hard to get those. Lab coats, disposable surgical gloves, sterile supplies, suture, all of those things became much harder to find. And we were fortunate to have vendors who were able to anticipate, substitute, work with us. Wouldn't have been able to do it without them. And you need a communication infrastructure. You know, we talk about Zoom or Skype or Teamsite or what have you. All of those have to be in place beforehand. You have to be used to working with them. Because again, if these hadn't been in place, we would have been in deep trouble trying to develop them while also dealing with all the other difficulties. And this is going to keep coming at us in waves. So we're taking the lessons that we've learned, we're moving on so we do better and better the next time. But we also know that we're going to be testing all of these functions probably fairly frequently for some time to come. So this is my personal favorite. I've been on several disaster planning committees over the years, and what seems to be fairly consistent is the disaster plan is the thing that you spend a lot of time in conference rooms discussing. You come up with a whole series of suggestions and an implementation strategy. That's going to take a significant amount of work. That's going to take a significant amount of money, stockpiling supplies, PPE, et cetera. And in my experience, what usually happens is you do a very watered down version of it because, of course, never going to have to actually roll our disaster plan. Of course, we did. Again, very fortunate in that within the company that I am at and within the site that I am at, we did have a disaster plan. We did follow it. We were as ready as we could be. And one of the things I put out there is your disaster plan, not only do you need one, it has to be something that you can follow. You can come up with a fantastic disaster plan. I've certainly worked on committees that have came up with outstanding disaster plans that were far too ambitious to follow, so we didn't do anything. It's much better to have one that is, let's say, a 7 out of 10, but you're actually going to do it, than one that is a 10 out of 10 that you're not going to. And again, it has to be ready in advance. We had alternate suppliers identified. We had triggers for extra procurement. We had already started cross-training and identifying personnel resources throughout the site, throughout the company, in case we had to cover for people who were no longer going to be on site for a certain period of time. And we also had a prioritization scheme. So what do you do if you simply can't stretch that blanket far enough to cover everything? How do you maximize your resources to get the critical work done and affect the ongoing, because we're responsible to our clients. They contracted with us. We owe them. So how do we minimize the impact on them when we're going through this as well? Which again goes back to the scientific expertise. That's a decision that has to be made with several people providing input. And if you don't have them available, you're going to have a difficult time. It's people. Ultimately, at the end of the day, everything that we do to deal with this revolves around people. There are employees, they're the other critical groups in-house, there are clients, there are our suppliers, they're the local authorities, because you may need a nice letter that says that you're essential personnel so that you can go back and forth to work. We had those. And as I'm emphasizing, and I can't emphasize it enough, this is based on the relationships that you have already established. And if you don't have them yet, you're never going to have a better time than today to start. You need those in place. You cannot be reaching out to people who don't know you and asking them to assist you, because they're getting asked by heaven knows how many people. And if those people have developed that type of a personal relationship, human beings are human beings. Who are they going to help first? So again, you can change a relationship, but it's really, really hard when everything is going south and everyone is under tremendous stress, and everyone is under tremendous stress. I bring up the people in my department who, again, they're wonderful. But part of the reason that we were able to weather this is before this happened, we pushed responsibility and decision-making authority down the organizational chart as much as we could. We gave them the training, we did their initiative, and we gave them the authority to make their own best decisions. You can't have a choke point. And certainly the larger the group you can have a very top-down management style that'll work when times are normal. When things are constantly up in the air and you as the leadership is getting pulled in whole series of different directions you never anticipated. If everyone is dependent upon you or a very small group of people to make every single decision, you will fail. And I've watched it happen before. I've watched it happen during this pandemic. And one of the pieces is not just you trust them. Do they trust you? Do they believe and understand, and do they have evidence that you're going to give them that ability to make those decisions, and you're going to protect them? Because we do make bad decisions. I make bad decisions. Everybody does. Do they know that they are going to make the best decision possible, or is it a risk for them? Because if it's a risk, people being people, they will default back to, I'm going to ask first. And if you get hit with 100 questions a minute, you cannot answer all of them. So you need that type of initiative. We had it. Thank heavens. And everything is interconnected, and you have to trust them. So again, you have to build those relationships back and forth. We have the people who take care of our animals. Had they fallen, we would have been done. Necropsy, ClinPath, our study directors, purchasing, client services, legal, it goes on and on and on. And if any one of those groups had dropped the ball, because we're interconnected, we might not have failed, although I suspect we probably would have, but it would have been immeasurably harder. And also, all of our people are dealing with outside stress. Many of us, myself included, have lost friends and loved ones during this. People at work or their close relations could develop the virus. People could get seriously ill. People could get Worse than that, there's the uncertainty. Have I been exposed? Have I not? When we couldn't get tests, etc. Especially in the early days when testing was difficult to obtain. And certainly much of my staff is relatively young. They were not a priority for testing back when test kits were difficult to obtain. Their loved ones have anxiety, especially when, as with all of us who have worked through this, if you're essential personnel, then everyone around you who is not is worried about you going out, interacting with other people. What are you supposed to? The schools are closed. We had to make numerous accommodations because people didn't have schools or childcare for their children anymore. So flexible scheduling became very important. There were no extracurricular activities. And people need things to do to regather their emotional energy. Well, all of those were shut down. People weren't going to the gym. They weren't going out with friends. And so the stress just built. And of course, there's an anxiety being in public. I mean, most of us can remember this as we were driving back and forth. It was spooky being out on the roads, especially in March and April, because you were alone. And our clients are going through the same thing. Everybody that we're interacting with is going through these same things. And so constant last-minute schedule changes, requests, we stayed open during this because as our various clients and the universities had to pull back their operations, we were the ones who were able to keep things moving along in all of these various areas of research. But all of those rippled into these studies as well. So if I have one message in all of this, it is take care of your people. And I'll add to it, you can't start taking care of your people when the disaster hits. You have to have a culture where they know that you are looking out for them and that you will do the right ethical thing for them, whether you necessarily have to or not. You have to be compassionate. And yes, the structures and the expectations and the accountability are at least as important as they were before, because people need structure. They need to understand what the rules and the requirements are. And if you throw all of that up, it's very difficult to work when you don't know what the expectations are. And what we found is that having that type of structure was actually a stress reliever. As everything is going unstructured in people's lives, having an area where there actually is structure, and there's accountability trees and what have you, was actually remarkably de-stressing. It was relaxing in a rather odd way. We did a lot of what I call wargaming and planning. You never make a decision as well when everything is going sideways as you would have when the stress is not there and the pressure is not there and the time constraints aren't there. And I'm very much an advocate of work your contingency plans before things hit the wall. In my group, my supervisors came to me with a great idea. Let's meet every morning at 8 o'clock. Let's triage. Do we have people out? What's the work? What are the changes that we're getting from our clients and so on? We ran that through May. And again, this requires that dedication and flexibility from our technicians. If I had poor technicians, none of this would have worked, but I didn't. I had outstanding technicians who rose to the challenge. As an aside, what was fascinating is our efficiency and our quality metrics just improved dramatically over the course of this, which again shows when people are rising to the challenge, a whole bunch of things are just taken in stride. But we were aggressive. We immediately implemented social distancing. We broke up. We have a large technician area. We broke that up. We moved people around so that we weren't sitting close together. Wherever possible, we had people working remotely. We moved our meetings to Skype and TeamSite, and we did that very, very quickly. And we closed our circle. We did not bring outside visitors to sites. We didn't bring clients. We didn't bring vendors. We kept ourselves to ourselves. And whenever, and we've had people test positive. We have had people who didn't test positive but required testing because of symptoms. We moved aggressively. We moved people into self-quarantine. We emphasized testing. We tried to break the, if you will, circle of people being able to communicate the virus to others. We were very aggressive, and knock on wood, it has stood us in good stead to date. And what this all meant, because of that flexibility, because of people willing to do things that maybe weren't part of their standard job, but if there's a need, the study comes first, we're going to get it done, and people pitching in, our impacts have been fairly minimal, even when we've had staff out due to either suspected infections or actual infections. But I put this in here because we weren't flawless, not by any stretch. And it's the little things. And we knew this beforehand, but there were things that we didn't think of. And one of the things that we didn't think of is we did a wonderful job preparing for our formal suppliers. But the things that you get at the grocery store, who would have thought that we would have empty shelves? I mean, to date, whenever we've had either an outbreak such as the avian flu or disasters, those are fairly rapid. They're not nation or certainly worldwide. But so we use clear drape, and we actually use press and seal, which we ethylene oxide sterilize as one of our common drapes, both because it's transparent, so we can more easily monitor our patient, but it also has a very, very low tack adhesive. And on mice whose skin is very thin, we don't want to irritate it. And a lot of adhesive drapes, the adhesive is fairly aggressive because they're designed for humans. They will cause issues for the animals. This is much more humane and relatively innocuous to our patients. And I'll just throw out there, call it an aside, regardless of the species, asepsis, so eliminating microorganisms from your sterile field, analgesics, i.e. pain control, they are important in every single species, and we treat all of our species the same way. For this, though, it's press and seal. You can go and buy it at the supermarket until you can't. And all of a sudden, for several weeks, press and seal disappeared along with so many other things from the store shelves. Never considered that. Never occurred to me that we would have that type of disruption to our commercial supply chains. We were fortunate. I got some people in my group. I have a management tree. We went to all of them and said, if you're at the store and you see this stuff, just buy it. And they did. And we were able to get enough to carry us through. And now that it's back on the shelves, we have stockpiled it. So if anything hits in the future, we will be ready. And there are other examples, but I put this out there. Look at your entire supply chain. Look at every single thing that you need to do your work. What this taught me is you can't make the assumption, consciously or unconsciously, that there are things you don't have to worry about. There are things that I didn't think we had to worry about, and we did. Positive relationships with our vendors are critical. Again, we depended upon them to go the extra mile. Had we spent all of our time yelling at them, had we spent all of our time every instance of a delay beating them down, would they have been as, frankly, wonderful as they were for us? They might have been, but they might not have been, and that's not a risk that I really want to take, and certainly I'm glad that we didn't take. And I put this in here because I think they do deserve a call out. Our STEREOTAXIC devices came from David Kopf, who in the midst of a shutdown, they were still figuring out ways to get me materials. World Precision Instruments, George Tiemann is another one that they were shutting down, but they still figured out a way to get us the stuff that we needed. VR for our PP and disposable supplies. There was a lot of creativity from people in our animal care unit who were taking care of that piece. We're jumping through hoops to make sure that that stuff arrived when we needed it. Again, had we had a bad relationship with them beforehand, we would not have been able to reset that during all of this. And it might have gone really, really badly for us. Understanding the equipment and really understanding the equipment. The example that I'll use is what happens if the people who show up to repair your equipment suddenly can't? Can you continue functioning? Or are the things that you plug into a wall socket, these magical boxes that someone will come and fix or calibrate, but you don't know how they work. You don't know how to troubleshoot them because, of course, you can always call in a repair person. They'll be there within 24 hours until they can't be. Again, you can't wait until the disaster hits. You have to be ready in advance. You have to do your due diligence and really understand, what do I need to know? We were fortunate. Again, David Kopf that company was jumping through hoops to get us things, but there were still delays. And our sponsor provided us some STEREOTAXIC devices. They were damaged in shipment. We had to fix them. And normally what you would do is you would send them back to the vendor and they would repair them, but they couldn't. What is very fortunate is back in the early 90s, I was able to attend a wonderful 3-day class on how to fix and repair these particular pieces of equipment. And I'm kind of a nerd in that area anyways, but it's always stuck with me how useful it is in the middle of, for instance, a study. I don't have to cancel things and wait 2 weeks. I can fix and repair. And in this case, I was able to recalibrate the units. I was able to use wonderful laser grid piece of equipment to reset everything in. And that enabled us to continue. If we hadn't been able to, I would have had to ship them back for refurbishment. I would still be waiting for them because the place and the engineers that would have fixed them have been shut down. Again, it's too late to get the training when the viruses hit. You need to do that ahead of time. And I emphasize, we know that we're going to experience waves of effects over the next few months, years, we don't know. So if you're not ready now, there's no time like the present to start getting that information. Things are starting to loosen up a bit. Now is the time to identify those gaps and get them filled, because maybe we'll be lucky and we won't have to go through another cycle of this. But if we do, we had best be ready. And the short version is, as I said in my spoiler, we were successful. We're actually over 11, but when I wrote this, we were at 11 studies with lateral ventricles, hippocampal injections, intrathecal injections as well. We're now over 500 surgeries since March. We've been able to train 12 technicians on the various support roles. In addition, 4 surgeons, apprentice surgeons, are validating. They started validating last week and they continue today, as a matter of fact, with another 5 to go. We're running 1 or 2 of these studies weekly. We were successful, and it was because of our people, and it was because of our pre-planning. So ultimately, what did I learn from this? You have to have the right people. They have to be dedicated. They have to be willing to roll with things. This was a very stressful time, and people could have been forgiven for not being able to roll with the metaphoric punches, but they did. They needed to be trained, and if we hadn't spent the time training, and I can't take the credit for that, that's my training arm. That's my supervisors. Those are my team leads who spent the time with the technicians and trained them. And then we have trained those people. They're independent and they're empowered. And they didn't become independent and empowered when we didn't have the bandwidth to oversee them. They were already there before all of this hit. You've got to have the positive functional relationships with the various key stakeholders and impactors. It's too late to develop them when everything is going sideways. You've got to have expertise in all of the areas. And I could talk at great length about all the various people who brought their specialized experience and knowledge to boot for this. We had prior planning, not just the specific disaster plans, but we had redundancies and contingency plans just ready, just in case. And we also had structures that enabled quality from all of our people when they were under tremendous stress. And they have been, and they continue to be. And stress is debilitating over time. One of the things that my supervisors did is they looked for opportunities to have appropriately social distanced, but events nonetheless, to have some fun and to relieve the stress and to look out for people. Hey, you know what? Why don't you work from home tomorrow? You have things coming up. Again, had I not had that type of an atmosphere and that type of a culture, it would have been too late to create it. But again, my supervisors did a wonderful job minimizing the stress and taking care of the people who worked for them. It all comes down to you have to be prepared, you have to be ready, and you have to be ready before the crisis hits. It's too bloody late to try and put all of these things into place after everything has gone sideways. And with that, there's a picture of my current ICV team. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.